It was December of 1944, and the world he had known was gone. Captured in the brutal confusion of the Hurtgen forest, he and the others had been processed, deloused, and shipped across an ocean they had only seen in newsreels. Now, the train was cutting a path through the heart of the enemy's homeland, America, and it was nothing like he had been told. He saw no armed soldiers on every corner, no starving masses, no evidence of the degenerate, crumbling society that the Reich's propaganda had promised. Instead, he saw endless, rolling fields blanketed in a pristine layer of snow. He saw vast, sturdy barns painted a defiant red against the white landscape, and tidy houses with smoke curling lazily from their chimneys. It was a landscape of peace, of impossible, infuriating abundance. He and the others in the car, all veterans of the Eastern Front, all men who had seen the very worst of humanity, were silent. They were meant to be on their way to a brutal prisoner of war camp, a place where the gangster-like Americans would exact their revenge. They expected to be starved, beaten, worked to death in the mines or factories of a nation stretched to its breaking point by war. This placid scenery, this picture of quiet prosperity, was a profound psychological shock. It didn't make sense. The guards, boys who looked barely old enough to shave, didn't scream or shove. They passed out sandwiches, thick slices of soft white bread with actual meat inside, and poured hot black coffee into tin cups. Coffee. Klaus hadn't tasted real coffee in 3 years. He took a bite of the sandwich, the bread impossibly soft, and looked at his comrades. He saw the same stunned disbelief mirrored in their hollow eyes. This wasn't the America they were promised. This was something else entirely. Something deeply unsettling. Their fear, so carefully cultivated for years, was slowly being replaced by a much more potent and confusing emotion: bewilderment. This deep-seated fear was no accident. It was a carefully constructed pillar of the National Socialist worldview, hammered into the mind of every German soldier and citizen by Joseph Goebbels' relentless propaganda machine. For over a decade, the image of America portrayed to the German people was a grotesque caricature. A nation depicted as a monstrous hybrid of Jewish-controlled finance, gangsterism, and racial impurity. The films, the posters, the radio broadcasts all told a single, unified story. America was a culturally bankrupt nation, a place where Negroes and Jews had corrupted the arts, creating degenerate forms like jazz music that were an affront to Aryan sensibilities. It was a land run by plutocrats and mobsters, personified by figures like Al Capone, whose violent exploits were presented not as an aberration, but as the American norm. Soldiers were shown newsreels suggesting American troops were undisciplined thugs, criminals released from prison, and handed a uniform, incapable of real martial discipline but experts in cruelty. They were told that the American industrial machine, while large, was a chaotic and inefficient mess, propped up by Jewish bankers and incapable of producing quality weapons. The M4 Sherman tank was a Tommy cooker, a rolling coffin. The American soldier was soft, spoiled by a life of consumerism and unwilling to fight and die for his hollow, meaningless nation. More insidiously, they were told that the American government, under the thumb of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, portrayed as a puppet of a global Jewish conspiracy, had no regard for the rules of war. Surrender was a death sentence. The Geneva Convention was a meaningless piece of paper to these barbarians. Captured German soldiers, the propaganda insisted, would be subjected to horrific tortures for information. They would be used for medical experiments, or simply shot and dumped into mass graves. Their organs would be harvested. These were not vague suggestions. They were presented as documented facts, grisly stories told by supposed escapees, or gleaned from fabricated intelligence reports. This constant stream of horrific imagery served a dual purpose. It dehumanized the enemy, making it easier for German soldiers to kill them without moral reservation. But more importantly, it was designed to stiffen their own resolve, to make them fight to the last man and the last bullet. The message was clear. Surrender was not an option. Capture meant a fate far worse than a soldier's death on the battlefield. This was the mental landscape of every man packed into that train car rattling through the Minnesota snow. They were the product of a system that had taught them to expect monsters. They were prepared for brutality, for starvation, for death. They were not, however, prepared for sandwiches and coffee. The American reality, when it finally presented itself, was so contrary to this programming that it bordered on the surreal. The policy that dictated the treatment of Klaus Richter and nearly 400,000 other German prisoners of war on American soil was not born of malice or a desire for vengeance. It was rooted in a combination of pragmatism, legal obligation, and a quiet, almost unspoken confidence in the superiority of the American way of life. The foundational document was the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified. The treaty laid out specific, detailed rules for the treatment of prisoners. They were to be housed in conditions similar to that of the capturing army's own soldiers, provided with adequate food and clothing, given access to medical care, and allowed to send and receive mail. For the Roosevelt administration, adhering to the convention was, first and foremost, a matter of strategic importance. With hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in German hands, any mistreatment of German POWs in the US could and likely would result in brutal retaliation against American boys captured in Europe. It was a simple, pragmatic calculation of reciprocity, but the policy went beyond mere legal obligation. There was a deeper, psychological strategy at play, championed by figures within the military and the State Department. They believed that humane treatment could be a powerful weapon of war. A German soldier, hearing through letters from captured comrades that life in an American POW camp was safe and the food was plentiful, might be less inclined to fight to the death. The policy could, in effect, encourage, surrender, and shorten the war. The logistical challenge was staggering. Building and staffing hundreds of camps across the country, from New Ulm, Minnesota to Hearne, Texas, was a massive undertaking. But it was here that the true power of America revealed itself. A nation that could simultaneously fight a two-front global war, build thousands of ships, tanks, and aircraft, and feed its allies through the Lend-Lease program, could also absorb an army of nearly 500,000 prisoners without its own citizenry, feeling a significant pinch. This was the unseen backdrop to Klaus Richter's train journey. The food he was eating, the warm train he was riding in, the well-fed guards watching over him, these were not signs of American weakness or softness. They were the casual, almost effortless byproduct of a continent-spanning industrial and agricultural superpower, operating at a level the German war economy could only dream of. The American strategy wasn't just to defeat Germany on the battlefield, it was to demonstrate that its entire ideology was built on a foundation of lies. They wouldn't do this with lectures or re-education classes, at least not at first. They would do it with white bread, hot coffee, and warm barracks. They would dismantle the Nazi worldview, not by attacking it, but by quietly, systematically, and overwhelmingly proving it wrong through simple, undeniable facts. For the men on the train, the first evidence had just been served. They were stunned. They couldn't believe it, and their journey into the heart of the enemy's world and the unravelling of their own had only just begun. The train finally hissed to a stop at a small, snow-swept siding. The doors were pulled open, and the command was given to disembark. As Klaus Richter and the other men shuffled out into the biting Minnesota air, they saw it. Camp New Ulm. It was exactly what they had expected. And yet, not at all. There was the familiar, menacing geometry of war, tall guard towers manned by armed soldiers, and long rows of tar paper barracks laid out with military precision. And of course, there was the barbed wire, glinting coldly under the weak winter sun, a stark metal web designed to keep them in. This part was familiar. This was the architecture of captivity they understood, but other details were deeply unsettling in their mundanity. The barracks, though simple, looked solid and well constructed, not the flimsy, disease-ridden hovels they had been warned about. Plumes of smoke rose from chimneys, promising warmth against the brutal cold. As they were marched towards the processing building, they steeled themselves. This, surely, was where the pleasantries of the train ride would end. This was where the beatings, the interrogations, and the starvation rations would begin. They were separated into groups, stripped, and herded into showers. The water was hot, hot, not the scalding or freezing water of a delousing station, but simply, impossibly, hot. They were issued new clothing. Simple but warm fatigues, thick socks, and sturdy boots. Then came the first meal in the camp mess hall. It was plain, but it was hot and plentiful. Beef stew, potatoes, bread, and more of that endless, miraculous coffee. In the barracks that night, huddled on their cots, the men spoke in hushed, cynical tones. "It's a trick," whispered a veteran from Stalingrad named Hans. "They are fattening us up, for what I don't know, hard labor in the mines, or maybe for some kind of medical experiment." The others nodded in grim agreement. It was the only explanation that made sense. This soft treatment was a temporary deception, a cruel prelude to a more terrible reality. They laughed at the fresh-faced American guards, who seemed more bored than menacing. They mocked the camp's commandant, who addressed them not as subhuman filth, but as enemy soldiers who would be treated according to the articles of the Geneva Convention. In the days that followed, as a routine settled in, their suspicion remained, simmering just below the surface. They were assigned work details, mostly on local farms, helping with the sugar beet harvest. The labor was hard, but not brutal. The farmers who oversaw them were quiet, reserved men who paid them the standard POW wage of 80 cents a day in camp scrip and often shared their own lunches. Still, the men held on to their skepticism. It was a shield. The world as they knew it was defined by cruelty, suspicion, and a clear line between friend and foe. This American world of polite farmers and hot coffee was a disorienting illusion, and they were just waiting for the mask to slip. As December deepened, a new and bizarre rumor began to circulate through the barracks. Christmas was approaching, a holiday that felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. The rumor was that local families, American families, were offering to host German prisoners in their homes for Christmas dinner. The notion was so utterly preposterous, so completely alien to their understanding of war, that it was met with derisive laughter. "Host us," scoffed Hans, spitting on the floor. "They will host us on the end of a rope. It's a propaganda stunt. They will take our pictures for their newspapers, sitting at a table with a plate of scraps, to show the world how humane they are. Then they will throw us back in the cold." This was the consensus. It had to be a lie, a psychological trick. They never knew an enemy could act this way. They were certain it was a trap. The collision with reality came on Christmas Eve. The camp commandant, a stoic officer named Captain Miller, assembled the prisoners in the main square. He announced, in a matter-of-fact tone, that the rumors were true. Dozens of families from the town of New Ulm and the surrounding farms had volunteered. Any prisoner who wished to participate was to sign up. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the barbed wire. It was one thing to hear a rumor, it was another to have it confirmed by the camp's authority. The men looked at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and a tiny flickering spark of something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Klaus, against his better judgment, signed his name. So did Hans, if only, he claimed, to see the trick for himself. The next day, Christmas Day, was surreal. A line of automobiles, Fords, Chevrolets, cars of a size and solidness that spoke of a different world, pulled up outside the camp gates. One by one, small groups of German soldiers, men who had months before been trying to kill American soldiers, were escorted out and assigned to a waiting family. Klaus and Hans were paired with two other prisoners and ushered into the back of a black Ford sedan, driven by a farmer named Arthur Jensen. Mr. Jensen was a quiet, middle-aged man with work-roughened hands and kind eyes. He nodded at them, said, "Merry Christmas," and that was it. The drive into town was a journey into another dimension. The small houses were adorned with wreaths and coloured lights. The streets were quiet, covered in a fresh blanket of snow. There were no soldiers, no checkpoints, no signs of a nation locked in a desperate struggle for survival. It was a portrait of a peace, so profound it felt like a deliberate insult. The Jensen family home was a simple, two-story farmhouse. The moment they stepped inside, the shock began. It wasn't one single thing, but a relentless sensory assault that dismantled their defenses piece by piece. First, the warmth, not the dry, oppressive heat of the barrack stove, but the deep, enveloping warmth of a home, radiating from a crackling fireplace in the corner of the living room. Then, the smell, a rich, complex aroma of roasting turkey, cinnamon, baked bread, and fresh pine from the decorated Christmas tree that stood glittering with ornaments and lights. In the center of the room, a Christmas tree. For them, Mrs. Jensen, a woman with a warm but weary face, greeted them politely and directed them to the dining room table, already laden with more food than Klaus had seen in one place in 5 years. There was a massive roasted turkey, a glazed ham, bowls overflowing with mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, and fresh-baked rolls. The Jensens' 2 young children, a boy and a girl, stared at the uniformed Germans with wide, curious eyes, not with the fear or hatred they expected. The immediate aftermath of that meal was a profound and unsettling silence. As Arthur Jensen drove them back to the camp in the fading winter light, no one spoke. The prisoners stared out the windows, but they weren't seeing the snow-covered fields. They were replaying the scenes from the farmhouse in their minds, trying to process the cognitive dissonance. They had sat at an enemy's table. They had been served by an enemy's wife. They had seen an enemy's children playing at their feet. The farmer, Arthur, had eventually told them his own son was fighting in the Pacific. He said it quietly, without malice, a simple statement of fact that landed with the force of a physical blow. The fact that this man, whose son was in harm's way, could open his home to them, the very people his nation was fighting, was an act of grace so profound it defied all logic and propaganda. Back in the barracks, the usual cynical banter was gone. Men lay on their cots, staring at the wooden slats above them. The room was thick with a shared, unspoken confusion. Hans, the hardened veteran from Stalingrad, sat on the edge of his bunk, his head in his hands. No one said a word. The foundation of their world had been shattered. They were soldiers of a regime that preached a gospel of racial superiority and strength through brutality. They had been taught that their enemies, especially the Americans, were a mongrel race, incapable of honor, discipline, or humanity. They were gangsters, criminals, and degenerates. But the people they had just met were none of those things. They were quiet, decent, and strong in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or ideology. It was a strength born of abundance, of confidence, of a moral certainty that allowed them to be humane, even to their sworn enemies. That Christmas dinner was not a propaganda stunt. It was something far more devastating. It was the truth. It was a quiet, irrefutable demonstration that everything they had been told, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed their friends and their souls for, was built upon a monumental lie. The taste of turkey and gravy had done more to defeat them than any tank or artillery shell ever could. They were stunned into a silence that would last for days, the first crack in an ideological dam that was about to break wide open. The profound shock of Christmas Day was not an isolated event. It was merely the opening salvo in a relentless psychological campaign. One that America waged not with bullets or bombs, but with an overwhelming display of its true nature. In the weeks and months that followed, as the Minnesota winter slowly gave way to a tentative spring, the German prisoners of Camp New Ulm waited for the other shoe to drop. They waited for the rations to be cut, for the kind treatment to curdle into the brutality they had been promised. They waited for the mask to slip. But it never did. Instead, the unbelievable became the routine. The shock of that first Christmas dinner did not fade. It simply transformed, breaking down from a single shattering event into 1,000 daily cuts that bled their ideology dry. This wasn't a temporary propaganda stunt. They were stunned to realize it was a system, a reflection of a nation so powerful and so confident that it could afford to be humane to its enemies on an industrial scale. The true weapon of American dominance wasn't the atom bomb or the B-17 bomber. It was the logistical capacity to deliver 3 hot meals a day, clean barracks, and competent medical care to nearly 500,000 prisoners of war while simultaneously fighting a global conflict. The most consistent and demoralizing front in this quiet war was the camp mess hall. 3 times a day, the men would line up and receive trays laden with a quantity and quality of food that bordered on the obscene. For breakfast there might be scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and that ever-present steaming black coffee. Lunch was often thick sandwiches, soup, or leftovers from the previous night's dinner. Dinner was the main event. Roasted chicken, pork chops, or beef stew, served with potatoes, vegetables, and often a dessert like canned peaches or a slice of cake. The caloric intake was calculated to be the same as that of an American soldier in basic training, well over 3,000 calories a day. To the German prisoners, many of whom had subsisted for years on thin soup, black bread as hard as a brick, and a Satz coffee made from roasted acorns, this was a daily miracle that defied comprehension. They couldn't believe it. The food became a source of constant, obsessive conversation in the barracks. Men would describe the meals in lavish detail in their letters home, letters which were read by their families and then passed around their German towns and villages, spreading a subversive truth that no Allied propaganda leaflet could ever match. A soldier would write to his wife, "Do not worry for me. I am eating better than I ever did in the army. We had roast beef last night," knowing full well that she and their children were likely surviving on a meager weekly ration of potatoes and cabbage. The psychological impact was devastating. Every bite of food was a refutation of Goebbels's narrative. The Reich had told them America was starving, its people rioting for bread. Yet here, in a forgotten corner of Minnesota, its captured enemies were feasting. The German High Command had demanded sacrifice from its people, insisting that every resource be funneled to the war effort. But the Americans, it seemed, could feed their armies, their allies, their civilians, and their prisoners without even breaking a sweat. It was a demonstration of agricultural and logistical might that was simply impossible to argue with. As the snow melted and the rich, dark soil of the Minnesota farmland was revealed, the prisoners were put to work. They were trucked out in the early mornings to local farms, contracted by a government desperate for manpower to replace the American sons who were fighting overseas. Many of the prisoners were farmers themselves, and they looked upon the American heartland with a professional and soon deeply shaken eye. They had expected primitive, inefficient operations. What they found were farms of a scale and level of mechanization that left them speechless. They saw vast, unbroken fields of corn and sugar beets stretching to the horizon, far larger than the patchwork of small family plots they knew back home. They watched a single farmer, perched atop a chugging green and yellow John Deere tractor, effortlessly plough more land in a single morning than an entire German village could in a week of backbreaking labor with horses. They were there to provide manual labor weeding the beet fields, stacking hay, but they were witnesses to a system of food production so powerful it seemed like a force of nature, and they were paid for this work. At the end of each week, they received scrip, special camp currency, amounting to 80 cents for each day worked. This scrip could be spent at a place that, more than any other, came to symbolize the maddening, seductive power of the American system, the camp canteen. The canteen, a small wooden shack stocked from floor to ceiling, was a temple to American abundance. It was here that the abstract concept of the enemy's economic might become tangible, something a man could hold in his hand. For the first time in years, these men were not just soldiers or prisoners, they were consumers. They could walk up to a counter and exercise choice. The shelves were a catalogue of impossible luxuries. There were brands they had only heard of in whispers: Camel and Lucky Strike cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, Wrigley's chewing gum. There were shelves of magazines filled with colourful advertisements for cars and refrigerators and lives of unimaginable comfort. And there was the strangest, most iconic product of all: Coca-Cola, served ice-cold from a red metal cooler. For a German soldier who had spent a winter freezing in a foxhole on the Eastern Front, the simple act of buying and drinking a cold, sweet Coca-Cola on a hot summer afternoon was a profound, almost religious experience. It was the taste of another world, a world where such simple pleasures were so commonplace they could be given to prisoners. The canteen became the symbol of everything they had been taught to despise but now secretly deeply coveted. It represented an industrial power that could not only produce tanks and planes, but also an endless supply of cigarettes and candy bars. It represented an economic system that generated so much surplus wealth that it could create a miniature consumer paradise in the middle of a prison camp. Every pack of cigarettes, every bar of chocolate, was a small, quiet admission of defeat. It was an acknowledgement that the American system, the one their leaders had called decadent and weak, could provide for its people, and even its enemies, in a way the rigid, top-down Nazi war economy never could. The new reality had set in. The daily routine of good food, mechanized farms, and the well-stocked canteen became the norm, a constant, grinding proof that the world they had come from was built on a foundation of lies and deprivation. Their belief system hadn't been defeated in a single glorious battle. It was being dismantled, purchase by purchase, in a small wooden shack in the middle of a Minnesota field, thousands of miles away from the snow-covered fields of Minnesota, in the cavernous, stone-cold halls of the Bendler block in Berlin. The unraveling began not with a bang, but with the rustle of paper. By early 1945, the intelligence division of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command, was facing a new and deeply perplexing threat. It wasn't a new Allied tank or a long-range bomber. It was the mail. Specifically, the mail coming from the nearly 400,000 German soldiers held in prisoner-of-war camps inside the continental United States. Sensors, both in America and Germany, read everything. But while American sensors were looking for military intelligence, their German counterparts started noticing a pattern that was far more dangerous. The letters were filled with descriptions of a reality so fundamentally at odds with the state's narrative that they could only be one of two things: clever enemy forgeries, or a truth so devastating it threatened the very will of the nation to fight. Initially, the reports were dismissed by senior officers as absurdities. An aide would present a summary to a general, detailing accounts from a camp in Alabama, where prisoners were forming their own symphony orchestras, or a camp in Arizona, where men were taking university-level courses. The general, a man who had survived the horrors of Verdun in the First War and the meat grinder of Stalingrad in the Second, would laugh it off. "Propaganda," he would snort. "The Americans are clumsy liars. Our soldiers are not fools. They know these are tricks." They were certain this was just another psychological operation, but the sheer volume and consistency of the reports became impossible to ignore. A letter from a private in a Minnesota camp describing a Christmas dinner with a local family was corroborated by a letter from a sergeant in a Texas camp describing a similar experience. A corporal in Wisconsin wrote about the camp canteen, listing the brands of cigarettes and candy available. An officer in Mississippi wrote about being treated by a competent, well-equipped camp doctor for a shrapnel wound that had festered for months on the front. These were not grand, sweeping statements about democracy. They were small, personal, verifiable details. A man describing the taste of a Hershey's chocolate bar to his wife was infinitely more powerful and believable than any propaganda leaflet. The High Command realized they were facing a weapon for which they had no counter. They understood warfare based on terror, deprivation, and ideological fanaticism. They had no strategic response to a war being waged with kindness and overwhelming abundance. The reaction, when it finally came, was a mixture of fury and desperation. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry launched a frantic counter-offensive. They branded the American POW program as a form of insidious psychological warfare, a tactic they called Seelenvergiftung, a poisoning of the soul. The official narrative was that the Americans were not being humane, they were being diabolical. They were attempting to corrupt the pure, hardened soul of the German soldier with decadent capitalist luxuries. This kindness was a trick, a way to break a man's loyalty to the fatherland, to soften him up, to turn him into a traitor. Special newsreels were hastily cut together for audiences back home and for soldiers at the front. They showed staged scenes, using actors in American uniforms, of German prisoners being cruelly treated. They amplified stories of actual Allied war crimes, presenting isolated incidents as standard policy. They ran articles in newspapers claiming the letters from America were fakes, mass-produced by Jewish propagandists in Hollywood, designed to fool their families and erode morale. But these measures were failing, because they were trying to fight a wildfire of truth with a water pistol of lies. The German state was a crumbling edifice. By the spring of 1945, Allied bombers were systematically erasing German cities from the map. The supply lines were shattered, the home front was starving. A wife in Dresden who hadn't seen meat in 6 months would receive a letter from her husband in America describing a meal of pork chops and applesauce. No amount of propaganda from Berlin could convince her that he was the one who was truly suffering. The letters, with their familiar handwriting and personal anecdotes, felt real in a way the shrill voice on the radio no longer did. The state had demanded total sacrifice from its people for years, promising a glorious victory. Now, with Russian armies closing in from the east, and the Americans and British from the west, the promised victory was clearly a delusion. The state's credibility was gone. The letters from the POW camps were not just undermining the official narrative, they were replacing it with a new one, a narrative in which the enemy was not a monster and surrender was not a death sentence, but a gateway to a world of unimaginable plenty. The most catastrophic impact of this soul poisoning was felt where it mattered most, on the front lines. For the average German Lanzer, huddled in a muddy foxhole on the shrinking perimeter of the Reich, life had been reduced to a grim cycle of terror, hunger, and exhaustion. He was being ordered by his commanders to fight to the last man for the honor of a nation that could no longer feed or protect his family. His leaders told him that the approaching Americans were vengeful gangsters who would torture and execute him upon capture. Then, a new man would be transferred into his unit, a veteran from another front who would whisper a different story. He'd tell of a friend who was captured in Normandy and was now in a camp in Oklahoma. His wife got a letter, the soldier would say in a hushed tone. He told her he's gained 10 kilos. He says they work on a farm, and the farmer's wife gives them lemonade. Such stories spread through the trenches like a virus, infecting the troops with a dangerous and seductive idea, the idea that survival was possible. The will to fight to the death is forged in the belief that there is no other option. But the letters from America created another option. A soldier, cold, hungry, and facing certain death in a pointless battle for a ruined town, began to weigh his choices. He could follow his orders, die a so-called hero's death for a lost cause, and leave his family to starve. Or he could find a way to surrender to the Americans and, if the stories were true, live to see his family again. He might even get a hot meal. The psychological impact was devastating to the Wehrmacht's commanders. They saw their soldiers, once fanatical and disciplined, beginning to surrender in droves. Entire units would melt away during an American advance, the men simply walking towards the Allied lines with their hands up, not in terror, but in weary resignation, even hope. The American strategy of humane treatment had effectively become a giant, invisible loudspeaker, broadcasting a simple message across the battlefield. Lay down your arms. The war is over for you. A warm bed and a full plate are waiting. It was a message that no threat of court-martial and no appeal to national honor could overcome. The German war machine was not just being broken by Sherman tanks and P-47 Thunderbolts, it was being disassembled, soldier by soldier, by the promise of a Hershey's bar and a cold Coca-Cola. The final verdict on the war, for the men of Camp New Ulm and hundreds of thousands like them, was not delivered in a courtroom at Nuremberg or signed on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay. It was delivered in the mundane, daily realities of their captivity, a slow, irrefutable judgment rendered not by generals and politicians, but by farmers, factory workers, and a system so powerful it could overwhelm an enemy's ideology with sheer, casual abundance. This was the ultimate expression of American dominance, a victory not just of arms, but of a way of life. The grand theme that had been playing out in the background of every hot meal and every purchased pack of cigarettes was the triumph of a system built on democratic values and industrial ingenuity. The Third Reich was a top-down command economy, a brittle structure that demanded total sacrifice from its people for the singular goal of war. It could produce magnificent tanks and terrifying rockets, but it could not do so while also feeding its own people well. It was a system that ran on fear and deprivation, promising a glorious future in exchange for a miserable present. America, by contrast, presented a system of such staggering depth and flexibility that it appeared to the German prisoners as a kind of black magic. It was a nation that could, at the very same time, build the world's largest navy, equip a global army, supply its allies with the tools of war, and maintain a standard of living on its home front that was the envy of the world. This wasn't just about industrial might, it was about the ingenuity that an open, free market society fostered. It was about the millions of individual farmers, like Arthur Jensen, making their own decisions, competing and innovating, creating a river of food so vast that the surplus could be used as a strategic weapon. The humane treatment of prisoners was not, therefore, an act of bleeding heart liberalism. It was a projection of power. It was the most confident, arrogant, and effective flex imaginable. A nation telling its enemy, "We can defeat you on the battlefield, and we can do it so efficiently that we have more than enough left over to treat your captured soldiers better than your own government ever did." The ultimate demonstration of this victory came in May of 1945. When the news of Germany's unconditional surrender crackled over the camp radios, there were no riots, no mass suicide attempts, no last-ditch displays of fanaticism. There was only a profound, weary silence, followed by an undeniable sense of relief. The war was over. The lie was officially dead. The process of repatriation began, a massive logistical undertaking that once again showcased the system's effortless competence. The men were processed out, given final medical checkups, and boarded the same trains that had brought them into the heartland years before. But they were not the same men. They had arrived gaunt, hollow-eyed, their minds caged by years of relentless propaganda. They left well-fed, healthy, and carrying a truth that was more explosive than any V-2 rocket. The final, climactic proof of America's total victory was what they found when they returned home. As the transport ships docked in shattered ports like Bremerhaven and Hamburg, the men disembarked into a nightmare. They stepped into a world of ruins, a lunar landscape of bombed-out cities where ghost-like civilians picked through mountains of rubble. This was the glorious thousand-year Reich they had been ordered to die for. This was the end result of their leaders' promises. They saw their own families, thin and dressed in rags, their faces etched with the trauma of a lost war and a collapsed society. The contrast was a physical blow. They, the defeated prisoners, were healthier and better clothed than the victorious civilians of their own nation. They had spent years in the enemy's grasp and had been treated with a decency and provided with a material comfort that was now utterly absent in their own homeland. It was in this moment, standing amidst the ruins of their own country, that the full scale of America's triumph became clear. The Americans hadn't just beaten their armies. They had won the argument. They had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that their system could protect, provide for, and sustain its people. While the Nazi system had led only to this total, apocalyptic destruction. In the end, the story of the German POWs in America is a quiet epilogue to the loudest war in history. It's a story that reveals the true nature of national strength. The Third Reich's ideology was built on a myth of hardness, a belief that cruelty was strength and that compassion was weakness. It taught that the will of the state was everything, and the life of the individual was nothing. It was an ideology that had to be hammered into its people through fear, because it was fundamentally brittle, an ornate and terrifying facade hiding a hollow core. It could not withstand contact with a simple, contradictory truth. The American reality they experienced was the opposite. It was a strength so deep and so unshakable that it had no need for performative cruelty. It was a power measured not in the goose-stepping precision of its parades, but in the sheer tonnage of its wheat harvest. It was a dominance demonstrated not by the ferocity of its guards, but by the quiet generosity of a farmer sharing his table on Christmas Day. Decades later, long after the camps were dismantled and the fields of Minnesota were returned to their quiet purpose, the memory of that experience would remain. For thousands of German men, their most enduring lesson of the Second World War was not learned in the terror of a firefight or the chaos of a bombing raid. It was learned in a warm farmhouse, over a plate of turkey and mashed potatoes. They came to America expecting to find the monsters their leaders had described. They were stunned when they found families instead, and in that simple, human discovery, an ideology of hate was disarmed, and the war was truly, finally lost.